Coronation Gulf, Western Canadian Arctic, the last week of August, 1940. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police schooner St Roch lies off a low gravel coast with a year's supplies lashed down on her deck, and her skipper is at the rail watching a line of ice about 4 miles out that has not moved since morning. Sergeant Henry Larson has been working these waters since 1928. This is his 12th season. Norwegian-born, master of this ship for most of her working life, he is not looking at the ice, because it is impressive. He is doing arithmetic. The same sum every year. How many days of navigable water are left? How many posts are still on the list? How far apart they are? And what the ice is doing in the water between here and the last of them. Freeze-up is not a date. It is a range, and the range moves. In a bad year it arrives 3 weeks early, and the last 2 posts on the list do not get their year. Whatever is still on the deck when the coast closes goes back to Vancouver, or stays aboard through a winter in the ice. Either way, the detachment ashore does not get it, and it does not get it for 12 months, because there is no second ship. His sailing orders told him which posts to serve, and in roughly what order. They did not tell him whether it could be done. On this coast, in this decade, the orders were a list of destinations, and everything else was carried in the man reading the ice. 3 things the orders did not contain. The first was the ship herself. What was it about this particular vessel that decided what the orders could reasonably ask of her? She was built for exactly this, and for nothing else. Launched at the Burrard Dry Dock Company in North Vancouver on 7 May 1928, named for the Quebec riding of Ernest Lapointe, the federal minister of justice then responsible for the force. Hull of thick Douglas fir, sheathed outside in Australian ironbark eucalyptus, one of the hardest timbers available, and braced inside with heavy beams. 2 masts, a 6-cylinder Union diesel of 150 shaft horsepower. A crew of 8 to 13 men living below decks in quarters Larson himself described as ugly, slow, and uncomfortable. The important thing was underneath. Her bottom was rounded, described in the literature as half egg-shaped, or as a salad bowl, so that when the ice closed on her, it would push her up instead of crushing her. That is not a comfort feature. That is a design decision that says the institution expected this ship to be caught, and expected her to survive being caught, on a routine basis. Her measurements are not agreed. Lloyd's Register in 1931 gives 90 feet registered, 24.7 feet of beam, 193 gross tons. Parks Canada and the Museum Record give 104 feet 3 inches overall. One scholarly bibliography gives 29.9 meters and 585 tons. The sources are measuring different things, and none of them is wrong. The range is real, and it is worth stating plainly, rather than picking one number. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of Canadian patrol between 1900 and 1980. The vehicle, the posting, the territory knowledge that years in one place, built in the officer who covered the same ground in 4 seasons, and the communities those officers served, in the full complexity of what that service meant in this era. Not Mountie mythology. The documented operational and human reality of patrol in a country whose geography required its officers to know their territory the way no centralized system has ever been asked to know it. What did 20 seasons in the same ice give this skipper that no chart, no forecast, and no dispatch has ever been designed to hold? And if you served in this era, or your family did, put it in the comments. If you served at a northern detachment, or your family did, which post, which year, and what did the ship bring that the requisition list had never been asked to record? Next on this channel, the Herschel Island Dog Yard, and the men who bred the teams every Western Arctic detachment depended on. Back on the road. That rounded hull tells you the second thing the orders never contained. What was this ship supposed to do in the 10 months of the year when she could not move at all? She became a detachment, not metaphorically, operationally. St. Roch wintered frozen into the Arctic in 11 separate winters between 1928 and 1948, usually in the region of Coronation Gulf and Cambridge Bay. Snow was banked up against her sides for insulation. A canvas housing went over the deck. In the Halifax refit, a battery bank went into the engine room with a small gasoline charging engine, so the shortwave sets could be worked without turning over the main diesel, which mattered a great deal across those winters, when the radio was the only thing that reached out. And the crew changed jobs. Documented plainly in the record. Once the ship was frozen in, the men stopped being sailors and went back to being constables. They ran dog team patrols out from the hull across the sea ice. They took census. They investigated deaths. They carried mail between camps. In 1934, the ship held a man named Ahigiak aboard, while he awaited trial for murder, because there was nowhere else in that part of the Arctic to hold anyone. So the sequence for those years runs like this. From roughly July to September, she is a supply ship. From September to July, she is a building, a police post with masts on it, sitting in ice, with a dog yard staked out on the floe beside her, and a patrol radius determined entirely by how far a team could travel and return on the food it could carry. Nobody in Ottawa could see any of that. What the institution had was a position, reported by wireless when the wireless worked. But the detachments ashore were not looking at her as a police post. They were looking at her as something else entirely. What did the arrival of this one small wooden ship actually mean at a post on that coast? It meant the year. The force had been on that coast since 1903, when posts went in at Herschel Island and at Fullerton Harbor. By 1919, the Arctic held roughly 25 detachments and something over 70 men. Herschel, Tuktoyaktuk, Coppermine, Cambridge Bay, Reed Island, Holman. Small places, 1 or 2 men, sometimes with a trading post nearby, and sometimes with nothing nearby at all. Every one of them ran on a delivery that happened once. Fuel for a year. Flour, tinned goods, ammunition for a year. Dog feed. Lumber, stove parts, uniform replacements, medical supplies. The mail, 12 months of it in a canvas sack. Letters answering letters written a year and a half earlier. Relief personnel, the man who has done his time, and the man replacing him, who cannot be replaced any other way. And the orders, on paper, already months old on arrival. There is no partial version of this. The ship arrives, or she does not. If she cannot get in, the post does not get a reduced service. It gets nothing, and it operates for another 12 months on what it has. That is what isolation meant here in practical terms. Not distance, but the fact that the supply line had a schedule of 1. Which puts the whole weight of the system on a single judgment call made at a rail in late August by a man looking at ice. And Larson was not making that judgment out of a manual, because no manual held it. Where did the knowledge that got that ship into those anchorages actually come from? A good deal of it came from Inuit men and women whose names took another 60 years to reach the plaque. The force employed Inuit special constables and casual hires as guides, interpreters, hunters, and dog handlers throughout the north. Their wives interpreted as well, and were paid for sewing, which was not a domestic detail but a survival requirement, because the skin clothing that made winter patrol possible could not be bought and had to be made and repaired continuously. On the 1940 to 1942 voyage, by the record, Larson carried no Inuit assistance. In 1944 he did. He stopped at Pond Inlet and took aboard Joe Penipakatuk, hired as a casual, later a special constable, with his stepson Ariak, his wife Letia, their young children, and his mother Panikpak, who served as the voyage's seamstress. Larson described Joe and Ariak as natural seamen and skilled hunters. Joe Penipakatuk was awarded the Polar Medal in 1974, posthumously, for that voyage. There is a disagreement in the record worth naming. A man who served aboard as special constable and interpreter in 1940 and 1941 later claimed that he had effectively been the pilot, and that the passage could have been made in the first season. That claim sits in the literature alongside the official account, unresolved. The pattern underneath it is not in dispute. The ship carried the supplies. The knowledge of where the water was shoal, where the ice went out first, where the game was, and how to survive a winter on that coast was substantially local, and it was hired by the day. Which raises the question of what the man at the end of that supply line actually was, to the people who lived there. In a place where he was the only representative of the Canadian state, what was he? He was the police. He was also the census. He was the mail. He was the coroner, the customs officer, the relief administrator, the game warden, the recorder of births and deaths, and in a medical emergency he was whatever he could manage with what the ship had brought in August. The Parks Canada record puts it directly. St Roch served isolated and relatively inaccessible detachments as a supply, patrol, and transport vessel, and as the government's representative, settling disputes and conducting census of the Inuit. That is not a policing description. That is a description of an administration operating out of one hull. And it worked in both directions. In 1937, a season Larson reported as carrying far heavier ice than he had ever seen in that part of the Arctic. The ship took aboard the crew of the Hudson's Bay Company vessel Fort James, lost in the ice. When that is the only ship on the coast, everyone on the coast is its responsibility. For an officer, this concentration of function is the operational subject of this channel. He holds knowledge the institution has no way to hold, because the institution has no other person there. But the same sentence has a second meaning, and it is not a comfortable one. If one man is police, government, food, and permission at the same time, then the relationship between that man and the community is not a relationship between a constable and citizens. It is something with a great deal more weight in it. What did that weight actually do to the communities on that coast? The Chikiktani Truth Commission, established by the Chikiktani Inuit Association in 2007 after years of federal refusal to hold a public inquiry, documented what happened in the Eastern Arctic between 1950 and 1975. It documented forced relocation of families from camps into permanent settlements. It documented the concept Inuit describe as ilira, the specific fear and deference that authority figures, including police, produced. And it examined the killing of Kimiat, the Inuit sled dogs. Here the sources disagree, and the disagreement should be stated exactly. The RCMP's own 2005-06 review found no conspiracy to kill Inuit dogs. The Commission's analysis of that review confirmed that hundreds and perhaps thousands of dogs were killed by RCMP members and other authorities in the 1950s and 1960s, and found the force's investigation legalistic and dismissive of Inuit testimony. Estimates of total dog deaths across the period run far higher again in some accounts. In 2019, the federal government apologized at Iqaluit for the relocations and the dog deaths. St Roch's Arctic service ended in 1948, before most of that, but she was a working part of the system that produced it. Her voyages are described in the official record as demonstrating and maintaining Canadian sovereignty, which means the posts she supplied existed, in part, to establish that Canada administered a territory that people were already living in. Both of these are true at once. The supply line was real, and the men on it did difficult, competent, sometimes lethal work. The institution it supplied did documented and lasting harm. Neither fact cancels the other, and a script that used one to avoid the other would be lying. The limits of that supply line were tested most sharply on one specific February night. What happened at Pasleigh Bay in 1942? The ship had been caught in early September 1941 on the west coast of the Boothia Peninsula in Pasleigh Bay, and she was going to be there 10 months. Constable Albert Joseph Chartrand, Quebec-born, known aboard as Frenchie, the ship's cook, regimental number 10155, had recently come back from a winter patrol. One account gives that patrol as 28 days and about 790 kilometers. On 13 February 1942, he died of a heart attack. There was no evacuation. There was no possibility of one. The crew buried him on the shore of the bay and built a large stone cairn over the grave, with a wooden cross and a brass plate they made themselves. Then Larson sent a patrol by dog team to bring a Roman Catholic priest, because Chartrand was Catholic and the crew were not going to leave it at that. Father Pierre Henry, an oblate missionary, came and performed the service. Here again the record does not agree with itself. The standard published account describes a patrol of 1,835 kilometers to fetch him, while another account has the priest traveling from the mission at Pelly Bay, roughly 300 kilometers away in a straight line. Straight lines are not how anyone travels on that coast in February, and the two figures may be measuring different journeys entirely. The range is what the record supports. That is the true dimension of this supply line, not the mileage from Vancouver. The fact that a religious service for one dead cook in February was a journey of weeks by dog team, and that it was made. Across 20 years in the Arctic, Larson lost one man under his command. That is the operational context. So what was this ship actually for, if a wooden schooner with 13 bunks was carrying that much? She left Vancouver on 23 June 1940, with orders to go through. Ice stopped her east of Point Barrow, and she wintered at Walker Bay on Victoria Island. Released in July 1941, she worked east along the coast, reached Goa Haven by the end of August, was hit hard by ice north of King William Island, and took refuge in Passley Bay for the second winter. In August 1942, she forced out, got through Bellot Strait, found the Hudson's Bay post at Fort Ross, and ran on through Prince Regent Inlet, Lancaster Sound and Davis Strait to Halifax, arriving 11 October 1942. 28 months. First vessel to make the Northwest Passage west to east, and only the second to make it at all after Amundsen's Gjöa. Then a refit, including the 300 horsepower engine, and out again on 22 July 1944 with a crew of 10 under wartime secrecy, back to Vancouver by the deep northern route through Prince of Wales Strait, Barrow Strait, and Lancaster Sound. 16th of October, 86 days. First single-season transit, first transit both ways. King George VI awarded the Polar Medal to Larsen and the crews, but the mission was not exploration. It was sovereignty, and it was logistics. To demonstrate Canadian administration of the Arctic, and to test whether far northern posts in the eastern Arctic could be supplied from the west if German submarine activity closed the Atlantic approaches. The famous voyage was a supply route survey with a police crew. The route worked. The system that used it was already being replaced. What replaced it? She left Vancouver on 23 June 1940 with orders to go through. Ice stopped her east of Point Barrow, and she wintered at Walker Bay on Victoria Island. Released in July 1941, she worked east along the coast, reached Goa Haven by the end of August, was hit hard by ice north of King William Island, and took refuge in Passley Bay for the second winter. In August 1942, she forced out, got through Bellot Strait, found the Hudson's Bay post at Fort Ross, and ran on through Prince Regent Inlet, Lancaster Sound and Davis Strait to Halifax, arriving 11 October 1942. 28 months. First vessel to make the Northwest Passage west to east, and only the second to make it at all after Amundsen's Gjöa. Then a refit, including the 300 horsepower engine, and out again on 22 July 1944 with a crew of 10, under wartime secrecy, back to Vancouver by the deep northern route through Prince of Wales Strait, Barrow Strait, and Lancaster Sound. 16th of October, 86 days. First single-season transit, first transit both ways. King George VI awarded the Polar Medal to Larsen and the crews, but the mission was not exploration. It was sovereignty, and it was logistics, to demonstrate Canadian administration of the Arctic, and to test whether far northern posts in the eastern Arctic could be supplied from the west if German submarine activity closed the Atlantic approaches. The famous voyage was a supply route survey with a police crew. The route worked. The system that used it was already being replaced. What replaced it? If this channel is going to keep documenting what Canadian patrol officers knew about their territories and what it cost the institution when that knowledge left, subscribe. There are more roads, more detachments, more crossings, more calls with 3 pieces of information the dispatch did not contain, and none of it was ever asked to write itself down. 20 seasons in the same ice gave that skipper a working knowledge of a coastline that no chart, no forecast, and no dispatch has ever been built to hold. And when he went ashore for the last time, it went ashore with him. And if you have a patrol route, a posting, a winter road, a detachment, put it in the comments. Which post, which year, and what did the ship bring that the requisition list was never asked to record? Next on this channel, the Herschel Island Dog Yard, and the men who bred the teams every Western Arctic detachment depended on.